Hey guys, welcome back. This is Sub LBC here doing another video update. And in this video, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about a subject that I think is kind of interesting in the BMW community. Really talking about some claims that I've heard made about the so-called reliability of some of BMW's newer engines. And I just wanted to kind of, give you guys my feelings about that whole thing, because I do think that it is kind of an odd statement, but not necessarily totally factually incorrect. But I think it also is incredibly important that you understand, the distinctions between the different types of engines and, how reliability can be interpreted. Okay. So in any case, obviously the straight six or inline six engine has pretty much been the workhorse of BMW for as long as I can remember. Obviously, they've done a lot of four-cylinder cars too, especially in the past, and they've obviously dabbled, quite a bit with V8s and even a V10 for a little bit. But at the end of the day, aside from like the most modern of like, the totally electrified BMWs, the inline six, internal combustion engine is still, the workhorse. So it's a really big deal when they do major revisions in the engine. And I just wanted to, kind of prep you guys a little bit on the history, from where we started and where we are now. So in any case, you can see here, guys, that this here is the S54. And this, of course, is the, engine that was featured in the E46 M3, which is what this car is here. The original Phoenix Yellow, by the way. And this is a really cool car. Obviously, this was a, a project that I'd wanted to do for, decades. And, this engine is claimed by some to be the greatest motor that BMW ever made, right? But it is of a a bygone era. There's no GDI here, there's no turbo here. It is an iron block, very very high compression, and this thing makes over 100 horsepower per liter, which on a norm or naturally aspirated car, that's a big deal even today. But unfortunately, with modern cars, with bigger engines, turbos, and all that, 333 horsepower is really like a Toyota Camry XLE in these days. But still in a chassis like this and having that 8,000 RPM redline, 6-speed manual or SMG transmission, this car is still a lot of fun. Handles incredibly well, and it doesn't have any of the crazy driver aids or nanny mode. This is a car that lets you get wet and reckless. It really does, and it's really kind of like the last of an era. As we made it into the E90s, in that version of the M3, the cars became a lot more like this car. This here is the E70 X5 to 2013. So this is pretty much an era of cars that replaced the E46 and the first generation X5. And obviously the big deal here is going to turbocharged cars, which was like a big departure for BMW at the time. But, it seems, I guess now, that it's something they obviously had to do in order to, compete in terms of horsepower and, all, the performance numbers that you really want to do, to keep in line with companies like Mercedes that were using turbos, for a long time. But in any case, the real meat of this video is to talk about, some claims that I've heard about the B58 motor and its so-called reliability, and to kind of, break that down a little bit. So in order to give it, some comparison, this here is the N55. And what's interesting is about at least this N55 is that this is the last N55 that was ever offered in any BMW X5. And you might say, wait, what? This is the E70. That's not possible. And yes, it is actually very possible, because this engine came from a 2017 BMW X5. So it did give me about a 52,000 mile rollback going with this newer motor. And it was a really great motor, obviously, pulled from a car that was still running, although, the back end of it had been, pretty damaged, and the car was, considered a loss. But I did get the engine complete with all the accessories attached, turbos, all the front bolt-on stuff, basically everything but the intercooler, and, but you get the harness. I mean, everything comes complete with the car. And that's really great, when you're going to be doing an engine swap. But in any case, with this engine here, this is the N55. So you could pretty much consider this to be the, the most evolved version of this particular type of layout, and this engine has kind of gone through a lot. Obviously when BMW was starting off with turbos, they were running a twin turbo inline six design, and it had forged internals, which made it, kind of, sought after by tuners. But there were a lot of other problems with that car in terms of the turbochargers, and also the the whatchamacallit, carbon buildup on the intake side was just horrendously bad with those twin turbo models. So BMW kind of identified those issues, went ahead and started using the twin scroll turbo, which in my opinion is a much better design, especially for those who want to like work on their own cars. You know what I'm saying? It's much easier to deal with just one turbo than two, and even like doing a turbocharger replacement is like not even close to an impossible job. It just isn't. So again, I like, just kind of making things more simple to increase reliability that way. Now, this is not a forged internal like the previous version of the inline six, and it doesn't, um, have twin turbos. Obviously, I believe both engines were open deck as well. So obviously these are engines that are kind of like, not really meant to be pushed to the limit, but can still give you some options in terms of tuning if you want to do it. Although, in my specific case, this car is not tuned at all. But anyways, guys, that takes us over now to the new B58, which unfortunately I don't have one to show you. But the B58, in my opinion, is kind of like, a major redesign. You know what I'm saying? Like, they've been updates kind of here and there with the inline six, but the moment you go back to forged internals, and if you go from a open deck to closed deck, and now you're running a lot more redundant hardware in terms of additional cooling support or additional reservoirs for the cooling system, and all the extra redundancies that have been added to the B58. I think it's pretty clear that we can say we're going into a new generation of inline six motors from BMW. Now, the thing is, though, guys, is that not all B58 motors are made the same. And, it's kind of perplexing because it seems that this is like glossed over a lot by people that make videos about BMW motors. And they'll, you'll see a lot of song and dance about how B58s are so reliable. But I mean, first of all, it's somewhat of a dubious statement in and of itself. And also, which B58s are we talking about? Because the first version of the B58 is not a good engine at all. Sure, you've got the forged internals, closed deck design, a lot of the redundant hardware to make the cooling system and the oil system and everything more robust. I totally get it, but one big controversial thing is moving all of the timing hardware from the front of the car to the back of the car, or back of the engine, I should say. And that's a huge issue, guys. I mean, because even with a motor like this, guys, I got my Vanos stuff right there, my timing hardware is all right there. And I even have a pretty good amount of space without, removing these shields, which is like pretty freaking awesome, guys, to get in here. Like, I can do my own valve adjustments. There's a lot of things that I've done on this car by myself, and it's just simply not a problem. And even with the N55, it is a more involved process, because of the fact that these are, turbocharged cars and the layouts are different. I mean, obviously you can see, intake going from here to the airbox, wrapping around, dropping down, have all this stuff that has to go along with it, feeding into your turbocharger, which obviously would not be there on a naturally aspirated car. And now you've got intercoolers to deal with. But even so, you've got the timing hardware here in the front of the car. And the real important part is here is that at the very least, you don't have to drop the engine out of the motor or out of the car completely to do like timing service, what I'm saying? Which is something that cannot be said for the B58. So because of stuff like that, I think it's kind of dubious to just say, oh, it's, more reliable because all of its forged internals and redundant systems. But at the same time, when required service stuff does come up, some of those things are just made next to impossible. That's, I don't know. Again, it kind of worries me. Another thing too is on the first generation B58s, they actually used a multiple timing chain system. So there's actually like a common sprocket that joins two different chains. One that goes from the crank to that sprocket, and then from that sprocket up into the timing areas. Like up here. But of course, that would all be buried, at the back of the car, below the cowl, where it's just like inaccessible in every way imaginable. But yeah, that was a really poor design. It just adds more complexity for no benefit that anyone that I've seen can like communicate. And obviously BMW agreed, because in the first major technical update of the B58, they went back to just a single timing chain, what I'm saying? Which obviously was the smart choice, what I'm saying? So that was a good thing. And, a lot of people were happy about that. And, this is kind of like where a lot of people were noticing that this is a pretty special motor, when you have all the forged internals and, all these redundant systems to make everything more robust. Yes, it sucks that, timing work on the engine is difficult. But, aside from that, these are like really, really incredible motors. And then BMW surprised everybody with the next technical update by actually kind of taking lead from Toyota and integrating port fuel injection with GDI. And this is a feature that I absolutely love. Now, it does kind of go against the grain, because now you are adding more complexity. You've got essentially a dual fuel system. But with port fuel injection, you pretty much now eliminate any kind of issues you're going to get with carbon buildup on your intake valves. And that is just a huge win. And it's one of the things that I absolutely loved about the Lexus IS350, for instance, which again is not a similar, it's kind of similar. I mean, it's a V, obviously not an inline, but it makes a little over 300 horsepower at 3.5 liters. So, they're kind of in the same class. But one thing I really loved about that motor is the fact that, it's Toyota, so it's really reliable. But you also get the GDI Plus port fuel, which is great for the intake valve. No more walnut shell blasting, to get your intake all cleaned up. So I really, really like that. And that's something I would not have expected from BMW. Usually they just say F you. You got to deal with your walnut shells. But yeah, and I think that's a huge win. So, if you are going to get a B58, that means you are going to have to get, one of the more modern BMWs at a much higher price, unfortunately. And long term, this is an engine that we still have to look at, to, again, say it's like reliable. I think an engine has to be around for quite a while before, at least 5 to 10 years of, careful monitoring, to see, what the true issues are and how reliable they really are. But, when you have an engine like that that's had 2 major technical updates and, combined with the fact that, from the ground up, it's a great approach, and I do think that, at this moment, the B58, third version, is the best inline 6 motor that BMW has ever made. Don't get it twisted. Even though I do love my naturally aspirated, S54, there's absolutely no comparison at all whatsoever when you look at the numbers. I mean, horsepower, torque, I mean, obviously they're not the same. I'm saying? This is obviously a totally different engine from a bygone era. But man, you can take these B58s and tune them up to just insane numbers, and they can do it right out of the gates. You don't have to really do any bottom end stuff or anything. I mean, it's just like right out of the gates, you have a platform that can be like completely, put on roids and just, you just go nuts. You know what I'm saying? And because of that aspect, and the fact, I think honestly, it's the whole adding port fuel to GDI is really what tipped the scales for me, because again, we still take it in the rear end with that, timing, moving from the front to the rear of the engine. But to get a port fuel on top of GDI as a, kind of like you get that in place, that's a pretty cool trade-off, you know what I'm saying? So, with that being said, guys, yeah, for all you guys that love B58s on the newer cars, I totally get it. It just sucks that there are so few chassis that can really make the most of it, because these cars, man, I probably have to make another video about this, but yeah, I've done a couple test drives on some of these newer BMWs, or brand new ones, really, with this new B58 motor. And, honestly, outside of the motor, there's really not much else to talk about, but that's a subject for another video. So anyways, guys, as always, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you all next time.